I was thinking about doing a video about civil rights. I did one on education and how the civil rights movement in a way impacted education negatively. And I was thinking about doing a video talk about civil rights laws, anti-discrimination laws, and how they have an overall negative impact on principles of freedom. And I might do that. And I was thinking about the Canadian Charter of the Canadian Charter of Freedoms and Rights. I don't remember the exact name of it. That was adopted in 1982, and that is real problematic because it in a way sets up sort of a tyrannical system over the provinces, and it gives power to judges to make arbitrary laws, essentially laws, not actual laws, court rulings, but basically laws for Canada, the provinces. But what this video is going to be about is Commonwealth Realms, and in the short time this video will be on, it's not going to really cover too much. It's sort of an introductory, and it's not going to be too well documented. It's not going to be too well developed is what I mean. But most people have almost no knowledge, so this might help people get a little knowledge. I'm wearing a hat. It's not the best looking hat, but I bought this hat, and I put this little Canadian flag pin, the 1965 flag, on the cap, the hat. I bought this at Rideau Hall in Canada, Ottawa, and it's this device is the Governor General's symbol with the crown and the lion. Where do we start? You have to really go back to the imperialism. We know that Great Britain started as the Kingdom of England, and with the death of the Tudor monarch Elizabeth in 1603, the closest inheritor to the throne was her first cousin, once removed, descending, James VI of Scotland, Stuart, James VI Stuart, the House of Stuart. So he became the King of Great Britain, the King of England, James I, as well as James VI of Scotland. So you had one monarch. This is going to bring us up to the present in a way. It's a similar concept. One monarch, James Stuart, over two kingdoms. The Stuarts were thrown out in a revolution in 1688. The British government said they fled. James II fled. The Jacobites said he was expelled, and they claim to still be the real rulers. No one much cares except for that faction. But and the Stuarts finally died out with the death of Queen Anne. Okay, so when she died in 1714, the new monarchy was Hanover. But we're not going to go into all the the dynasties. But Elizabeth II descends from all of them: Tudor, Stuart, Hanover, and the present dynasty Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, which calls itself House of Windsor. That's a made-up name. All right, anyway, in 1707, there was the Act of Union. The Parliament passed the Act of Union, which combined the kingdoms of Scotland and England into the Kingdom of Great Britain. And in 1801, a new Act of Union went into effect, which combined Scotland, England, and Ireland. The colony, Ireland, it was the Kingdom of Ireland, but it was really a colony of Great Britain, a territory ruled by them, and it was absorbed as part of that bigger union, and they called it the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. 1922 was revised as Great Britain and Northern Ireland because Southern Ireland became its own dominion. All right, well, I don't want to go too slow, but I want to make sense. Okay, so we have the shared powers, right? With the revolution, the glorious revolution, bloodless revolution in 1788, and then the war in 89, and the Battle of the Boyne and all that. All right, so we have this shared system. There was always tension between the monarchy and Parliament. Parliament wanted to have a lot of power, if not all the power, and the monarch wanted to have a lot of power, if not all the power. And they had these constant struggles, even had a civil war, as you may know, in the 1640s. And then you had these factions, the people that wanted a strong parliament and a liberal government, the Whigs, and the people that wanted a strong executive branch, monarch, the Tories. So since 1689, there's been sort of like a truce. The monarchy will rule, but share power with the parliament and not try rule with the law instead of over the law. Maybe that's a good way to put it. And then as time went on, tradition began, or as they say, convention began to take root. Not legal requirements so much as just a tradition of doing things a certain way, which became so ingrained that the convention or the tradition is in some ways as powerful as the law. Because in a way of looking at it, the one way of looking at it is the law doesn't really even matter anyway if you don't follow the law. So the law is only as good as the people that are going to implement it, right? So in a way, the British system is superior to the US system because there's an understanding that it's the spirit of it that is more important than the technical letter of the law. In America, we have the letter of the law, the letter of the law. But then the spirit of the law is not very good. So the president, right, is supposed to be like a chief magistrate, a secretary, like the chief secretary of the country. And that's what they talked about in 1788, 1787. But then, and if you read the letter of the law, the president isn't particularly powerful. The Congress is much more powerful. On paper, they can impeach and convict and remove the president. They can override all of his vetoes. But in practice, in some ways, the president is almost like a Caesar, like Tiberius, right? Tiberius Obama. But of course, there's another way of looking at it. Congress doesn't have to do anything. They can refuse to go along with the president. We don't want to get into the American system, but we're going to go back to the British system. Okay, so you have this truce. And then with Victoria, Queen Victoria in 1837, who really had no interest in the British legal system and frankly didn't have much understanding of how government worked. She always deferred to the leader of parliament, the prime minister, the head guy in her cabinet. And the cabinet, the British cabinet, comes from the parliament, different ministers of different, in America we have the cabinet, but that's the executive branch. So she just deferred to, whatever they wanted to do. She might ask questions. Benjamin Disraeli or Gladstone would say, let's do this or that. And she'd say, oh, okay, Now you had people previous to her, like George III, who was extremely interested in the operation of the government. He was very jealous of the king's power, and he was dead set to preserve the prerogatives of the royal, the monarchy. So there was a lot of tension between him and the parliament. And, he had his faction, the Tories, are very much enthusiastic about him, having a strong executive presence. And then you had the Whigs who You know, they say he's a dictator and all of that. So, or he's a wannabe dictator. And then you had the Whiggish faction that was so strong in America that they had openly revolted, not just against the king. They just said, heck, we'll just revolt against the whole empire, even though we claim we're loyal to the king, which showed how much of a sham that their oaths of loyalty were. But anyway, off of that subject, we know the USA, the Federated Republic, so-called, really unitary empire, whatever. But all right, off of that. Now, so the USA was a result of this British colonialism around the world. All the European countries, you know, the ones on the edge of the Atlantic, not insular in the Mediterranean, they all went out colonizing. The Dutch, the Spanish, the Portuguese, originally the Portuguese, the first, the French, the English, the Swedes a little bit. They didn't do too much. The Danes did quite a bit. The Italians got into the game so late, they didn't accomplish much. Of course, somebody's going to call. They always call you. 8 hours the phone won't ring until I get on video, and then it's going to ring nonstop. But they can leave a message. So this idea, we're going to go and set up colonies in the wilderness, and then eventually we'll just take over other countries like all. One of those recorded messages talking about government, somebody bothering me from the government. So this idea that, you know, we're going to set up this new England in the wilderness, and then eventually we're going to just take over everybody, right? Like take over all of Africa, and you know, they had the big colonial race because they ran out of wilderness, so they just started fighting each other. We know that whole story led to World War I, World War II, present struggles, the present Cold War between the United States and Great Britain on one side and Russia and their allies on the other. They told us the Cold War ended. We know that did not happen. All right, but anyway. Okay, now the first very successful group of colonies, the 13 colonies, the rebellious colonies, claim they were being tyrannized. We know today evidence shows that was not true at all. Or if it was true, it was minimal, right? Minimal. It was just an excuse to break away. They weren't being tyrannized. That's just propaganda by people that you know, want to promote hip hip hooray. But the British were very disturbed that they lost those colonies. It was so profitable, and they decided, well, we made a truce between Parliament and the monarchy. Maybe we can make a truce between our colonies, because as the colonies grow, they were so, you know, concerned that the colonies would grow, especially the Canadian colonies, and that the Americans would try to suck them in, take them, make them part of America, which actually when the Americans rose up for their independence, the first thing they did was invade the Canadian colonies. It's kind of a strange thing to do. You're fighting for independence, so you immediately invade Canada to try to take it over. But, you know, why nitpick with history? And then, of course, in 1812, the first thing the Americans did to fight against tyranny on the sea was to invade Canada. Again, try to take it over. So that's how you fight for freedom. You take over other countries. But anyway, they were so scared, you know, that the Canadian colonies would develop and that they wouldn't get any home rule or a self-government. They might try to break away. And there was America right south of the border breathing heavy like, we want it, we'll take it. It wouldn't take a whole lot for them to jump in and grab. So the British government started a slow, gradual process of self-government by various stages. And this, for the most part, has been very successful. Now, going back to Great Britain for a little while, they had Queen Victoria, and she ruled from 1837 till 1901, more like reigned, because, like I said, her interest in government was minimal. Her son, Edward VII, had more interest in government. He had a much better understanding of government. So his involvement was a lot more pronounced, and he got into some conflicts with his ministers and his advisors in the Parliament, because he, you know, said, I want it done like this, I want it done like that. And they say, well, the tradition is the parliament's going to rule everything. You're going to do what the prime minister say. And his attitude was, yeah, okay. Well, anyway, this is what I want to happen. And he was very concerned about Germany. And he did a lot to line up European countries against Germany. Now, you see, by the time of Edward VII, 1901, the general impression was that the British monarch was simply a figurehead that had no real power and just was sort of like a puppet, much like the Japanese emperor, who really was a figurehead and essentially a puppet from the get-go up until today. Although the Japanese people thought the emperor, the people thought the emperor was this great, powerful man that ran everything, when in reality he was a guy that just stayed quiet so he didn't wake up dead in the morning. But in Great Britain, it was a little different. So Edward VII, no, he did not try to run the day-to-day operations of the government. No good leader would be successful doing that anyway. You had British leaders in the past that tried to do that, and they did a very poor job, you see, and it didn't work out that way. In Spain, you had Philip II. He's going to try to be a micromanager. He's going to run everything, and he basically destroyed the Spanish Empire. He had a good heart. He meant well, but it was just an unworkable situation. So under Edward VII, you sort of had this idea that the monarchy would be a guide for the country, but not the manager of the country. So the prime minister, he's the lucky guy, he or she, in case of Margaret Thatcher. She or he is the lucky guy because she gets to do all the dirty work, the day-to-day operations of government, the real headache stuff. Got to fight with the opposition party all the time, although they generally work together. But they got to do all the drudgery, right? And the king or queen will do the ceremonial stuff that a prime minister wouldn't really have time to do anyway. And then, but of course, if you get on the website of the British monarchy or you read about the British monarchy, which I've done for years and years and years, they're not just a figurehead. Like I said, the prime minister has to meet the monarch every week. The monarch doesn't go to the prime minister. The prime minister reports to the monarch. The convention, the traditional way is that the monarch, like I said, doesn't run the day-to-day tasks of the government, but advises the prime minister in private. And we're going to get to politics in a minute. Can suggest things, can ask questions about things, and can warn the prime minister about things, but doesn't ever publicly make statements for party A or party B. And that was the problem with the monarchs in the past. They would favor one faction over the other. And it's sort of like the president of the United States, who openly favors one party. So you always have half the people hating the president and the other half loving the president. It's a real problem. So it's, like I said, it's a truce. And it's a better way of doing it because you've got the monarch, the king or queen, they're in the background. They're on the throne, just like observing. And they'll read the speech from the throne every year, which is sort of like the game plan of the ruling party for the year. It's written by the prime minister's people, but the queen reads it. But if you read it, if you pay attention, she'll say, my government's going to do this and that, not I'm going to do it. And the kings never veto anything. In fact, they haven't vetoed anything since Queen Anne, officially. But that goes back to the understanding part of it, the convention part of it. You see, because George IV, I'm sorry, and then William IV, and then Edward VII, and later George V, and George VI. Well, we're going to get to Edward VIII in a little bit, but they would reserve their comments to the prime minister in private. Okay. And so and in the case of George IV and William IV, they would let it be known, not say it publicly, but they have their own people out there, right? They have their people. The Queen today, Elizabeth II, she has her people that represent the crown and the palace. And he let it be known, he would let it be known that if certain people voted for a bill he didn't like, that they would be considered, and they would not be considered a friend of the king. And there's a lot of patronage and a lot of favors that can be handed out and a lot of backs that can be scratched and a lot of movements and shaking that can be done behind the scenes, up and down the road, and you know what I mean, in the attic and in the basement. So they wouldn't have to veto a bill because the bill would never, it would never pass. It probably wouldn't even be submitted to a vote in the parliament. It would just get tabled. So it's like that today. The Queen doesn't veto any bills because she generally, well, what gets passed is what the royal family wants, is what I'm trying to say. Are they a dictatorship? No. Are they a powerful influence? Yes. And they're not just sitting up on the throne doing nothing. Okay, we're not talking about Sweden right now. All right. So this government openly is what you see in Parliament. A lot of the stuff happens behind the scenes and you don't see it, and you're not going to see it. You might hear about it in a rumor, but you're not going to see it. Okay. We have a little, I'll say we, I'm not from Great Britain, I live in Louisiana. We had a little problem in 1936 when George V died. He had a son. He was, by all accounts, mentally unbalanced. Really smart guy, real smart, David. David was his son, Prince Albert. Smart guy, very interested in politics, a little bit too interested in politics. You know, we don't know the whole story, but the king was really concerned, and he let everybody be, you know, I say they let it be known. He let it be known that this prince should never be the king. He just should not be the king. He was not qualified. His mental state was in question, and his ambition was in question. He, you know, he seemed like he wanted to be maybe a James II. You know, there was some concern about it, and he had a tendency to break convention. Like he would make political statements while he was the prince. Really a problem. He seemed to favor one party over the other. He seemed to have a bit of a admiration of the fascists in Europe, Mussolini, Hitler. Of course, that's probably been blown out of proportion by the people that don't like him, since he lost the, you know, he lost the game. He lost the game. So when you lose the game, the side that wins writes the history. Just like all that stuff about Caligula may not be too true. You know, a lot of stuff's exaggerated, but he lost the game, so then his enemies write the history, and all you hear is the bad things about Caligula, whether they really happen or not. But it does seem to be the case that the new king, Edward VIII, had some real serious problems, and they didn't know what to do about it, because this guy, maybe he did want to actually rule instead of reign, and he did want to be a day-to-day administrator. We just don't know. He didn't last a year, okay? Luckily, they caught they caught a lucky break in Great Britain, because they found out he had a real bad weakness. He was like addicted to women, right? Addicted to sex with older women, of all things. You know, he was a real strange cat. Well, they were able to use that as a weapon against him. And then, you know, he got hooked up with this, what the Baltimore Sun-Times called this prostitute from Baltimore. But he basically destroyed his own, his reign through his running around with this really extremely questionable woman who may or may not have been sent in to co-opt him or whatever. But so he was put out. So ever since Edward VIII, his whatever ambitions he had were cut short, cut off at the knees, right? So George VI and his daughter, Queen Elizabeth II, went back and followed convention. Whether they wanted something done in the government or not, you sure weren't going to know about it explicitly on television. You might get some oblique information about it through the rumor mill, whether they did or did not want this bill passed, or whether they did or did not want to be involved in this conflict in the Falkland Islands or whatever, you know. So that's been very successful. Now you say, what does it have to do with Commonwealth Realms? Well, it has everything to do with it, because now we go back to Great Britain trying to figure out what to do with these developing colonies. So you have all these British people, which means British, English, Welsh, Irish, Scottish people move into all the colonies, right? And then in Canada, you had a specifically serious problem with, you had the French, the remnant, which is a huge remnant of the French Empire. They weren't very happy about losing the war in 1763, but France wasn't going to come help them. And the British attitude was, well, forget you, you lost. If you'd have won, you'd be making us all speak French. Well, you'd probably be a lot more severe on us. You'd probably be making us speak French instead of, in our case, we're just letting you speak French and not trying to make you all turn British. So what the British decided to do with Canada is to let those colonies, and Canada was different colonies, right? Upper Canada, Lower Canada, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and let those colonies slowly, why are these people calling me, develop into responsible government, meaning that the colonies would have, to a large extent, self-government. And the British were trying to do this also with Ireland. I don't know who the hell that is called. Excuse my language. Who that is called with Ireland. So these colonies became, to a large extent, internally self-governing. They had a British governor appointed by the Crown, but really by the Prime Minister on it. The Crown on advice of the Prime Minister. And let's say Prince Edward Island, they ran their school system, and they ran whatever, highway they would want to build, or however that situation, the internal government, they ran it. All right. The British decided, and then Newfoundland had internal responsible government in the 1850s. So the British said, well, let's create a country called Canada, a federation of states, or in their term, the terms they use, confederation. So the colonies negotiated in the 1860s, and they decided, we're going to create like a super colony, a federation of colonies. We're going to call it Canada, or the Dominion of Canada. They wanted to call it, or they thought about calling it the Kingdom of Canada. But they knew the Americans were kind of weird about calling things kingdom, and they didn't want to really incite them. So they said, okay, we'll call it a dominion, which means a kingdom. But they figured Americans didn't know a whole lot about those terms. So they would say, you can't have a kingdom, but a dominion, that's okay, even though dominion means kingdom. So in 1867, we have this super colony called the Dominion of Canada. They did the same thing with Australia. They took the different colonies, Western Australia, South Australia, New South Wales, Tasmania, and all of them, Queensland. And in 1901, that went into effect, the Commonwealth of Australia, a federated colony, okay? Self-governing colony, but still a colony, because the government of Great Britain, the Parliament of Great Britain, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, to a large extent, influenced the colonies, especially in foreign affairs, okay? Not so much with internal issues. When the United States negotiated boundary disputes with Canada, or they were going to build this border area, whatever, this border park, a park along the border, or they want to settle some financial dispute, they would negotiate with the government in Great Britain, not Canada. Then New Zealand became now what they called these self-governing colonies were dominions, okay? New Zealand became a dominion in 1907. They created a new dominion, another federation, the Union of South Africa in 1910, which was 2 British colonies, Cape Colony and Natal, with 2 conquered Dutch countries, Transvaal, South African Republic, and Orange Free State, Orange Free State. Okay, so that became a federated colony. So you had these super colonies, Australia, Canada, the Union of South Africa, and you had Newfoundland, which was a dominion, New Zealand, a dominion. All right, and so this worked very well. World War I came about, and all the dominions were automatically at war with Germany. There was no separate declaration of war. They were just automatically considered at war with Germany. Now, after the war, and then Ireland, or the 80% of Ireland that didn't break, that broke away from Great Britain, became a dominion, the Irish Free State, 1922. Northern Ireland continues to be a country of Great Britain today. So you had a new dominion, self-governing colony. But these colonies, they said, well, we really want to be considered more like countries, and have more independence, more independence. So the British government agreed, and they negotiated and talked, and they decided to create in 1931. They passed the Statute of Westminster, which was an idea that now all the colonies are equal to Great Britain. They'll be considered equal. They weren't really technically equal. They'll be considered equal. And they're not going to call it the British Empire anymore. They decided really to call it the Commonwealth of Nations. And a Commonwealth really means a country. So like a country of countries, okay? The Commonwealth of Nations is what they created in 1931, which really means a nation of nations. Because the term empire wasn't really apropos anymore, because you have an empire connotes you're ruling over other countries, but now it's sort of like we're a family of countries. Let's think of it like this. You have a mother, Great Britain, and she has a bunch of children. Well, they grow up. The first child kind of like broke away, left the house in a huff and had a big family fight. And they visit a lot, but they're not part of the family anymore, right? They change their name. But the other children are growing up now too, so you can't expect the children are going to live in the household forever and going to do what the parents say. I mean, they're going to love the parent, but they're adults. They want to be treated like adults. And Canada was an adult. They're the second oldest child. So they moved out, got married, had their own kids, and they're the Dominion of Canada. Still, they have the same mother, but they're creating their own family now. They have their own identity. But they did show that they did show their British heritage, because if you look at all the old flags, and still today the flag of New Zealand and Australia and other countries, they have the British Union Jack, the Union flag, Ireland, Scotland, and England, in a field with you'll have the little Canadian device, or the Australian device, or the Cook Islands device, or the New Zealand device. And in Canada, there was controversy with the French. They said, oh, we hate that British flag, and they always bellyache. And so the Canadians finally decided, oh, okay, fine, we'll just make this maple leaf flag in 1965. It doesn't represent any ethnic group, the British. It just represents maple leaves. We have those in Canada. Okay. Although the Union flag is still considered an official flag of Canada. If you look on the Government of Canada website, the old British flag, it's actually an official flag of Canada. But let's go to the government a little bit. So when they passed the British North America Act in 1867, and then the Australia Act in 1901, the New Zealand Act, the Union of South Africa Act. What they did was they said, okay, we're creating these countries, and they said you're going to have a queen, the queen is creating these countries, or the king, and you're going to have a governor general who's going to represent the queen. And in Spain, they called him a viceroy, a vice regal, like a vice king. Like we have the vice president, like the vice, because the queen obviously could not be in all the countries. So in the past, they would have a governor representing the crown, and now they have a governor general who represented the crown, and at that time, the British Parliament as well. And then, of course, Canada had their own prime minister, which was elected by, the chief guy in the parliament, whatever party was ruling parliament, the Conservatives or the Liberals, usually, whatever, either one of those. Or Australia had their own parties. So it was like they mimicked the British government. And in Canada, they had a Senate, which mimicked the House of Lords. The Senate is appointed today, still appointed. And Australia has a Senate. Okay. Some of those dominions are adopted a unitary government, which is a single parliament, no House or Senate. Now, legally, though, they passed the Westminster law. But in many ways, those countries, those dominions were still colonies in many ways. In a traditional way, they deferred to Great Britain. Like they were sort of like the leader. So like New Zealand, they say, you're equal to us. Fine. Then in 1941, Britain goes to war. I mean, in 1939, the British declare war on Germany. And they said to the New Zealand prime minister didn't say we're going to declare war on Germany. He just said we're at war with Germany. In other words, he didn't feel like there needed to be a declaration of war because his words were, wherever she goes, we go. In other words, wherever Great Britain goes, we go. So if she's at war with Germany and the king is George VI and he's the king of New Zealand, then, hey, we're at war with Germany. And they hadn't actually ratified the Treaty of Westminster until 1942 anyway. I'm talking about New Zealand. So their parliament. So you have the king in Great Britain, and then you would have the king in Canada, the king in Australia, the king in New Zealand. Okay. After World War II, we have a new problem, or I would say a new challenge. India. This sort of like sets this next stage. India had all these internal problems going back thousands of years. Okay, but they came under the control of Great Britain, and the British agreed, because when you joined the United Nations organization, you agreed that you were going to give up your colonies. Okay, so the British agreed they're going to give up all their colonies. Plus, they're very big, expensive to rule. India was a real problematic situation. We don't want to get into that, but it was really problematic. They ended up partitioning India into new countries, India and Pakistan. Later, Pakistan broke apart into Pakistan and Bangladesh, 1971. So in 1947, the British created a new dominion called the Union of India, and the King of Great Britain, George VI, was just like in Canada, the king in India. And he had a governor general, Lord Mountbatten, who was murdered by the Irish rebels in 1979. We don't want to get into that. But the Indians decided, no, they didn't want to be a dominion. They really weren't British, so they didn't have any kind of ethnic connection to the British crown, really. And they declared themselves as a republic, which went into effect in 1950, just like Ireland had declared themselves a republic in 1949. It went into effect in 49. And they broke away from the Commonwealth. They just hated being, they didn't even want to be in the family. They said, we don't consider ourselves part of the family. You made us be part of the family, the Irish. So the Indians did like the idea of a cooperation among nations, though, this nation of nations. They just wanted to be a republic and have a president, like India today has a president instead of a king. So the British said, oh, what are we going to do about this? And they decided, okay, you know what we're going to do? You can have a Commonwealth of Nations, and we'll allow republics to be part of it. Even though they'll have their own president, they'll have no actual legal ties to Great Britain's parliament, they'll still be part of this family of nations, this nation, this country of nations, this Commonwealth of Nations. So that was the new precedent. You could become a republic and remain in the family of nations. Pakistan became a republic in 1956. Queen Elizabeth actually was, most people don't know this, but Queen Elizabeth was the Queen of Pakistan until 1956. She was the Queen of Trinidad and Tobago, Queen of Malta, Mauritius. Some of those dominions, they did declare themselves republics. But let's go to the dominions. Other countries came online as they dismantled the empire, the British Empire. Some countries became republics, you know, most of them, Nigeria, Sudan, and some did not want to be in the Commonwealth. Others did. Their choice, no big deal. But many of them did choose to remain dominions. And some new countries became self-governing, but they remained dominions. Jamaica, 1962. They became a dominion, but they are still a part of the British crown system today, and I'll explain that in a minute. Some chose to remain colonies. The Cayman Islands are still a British colony. What they call it, an overseas territory today, but it's the same thing, you know. The Turks and Caicos Islands said they would stay a colony. And, you know, some of them were just so small, they figured it was easier just to let the British run some things, more convenient. A lot of these countries became independent, and it turned out that independence wasn't all it was cracked up to be. They counted more problems than they had before. Like Nigeria, for instance. Yay, we're free. Now they descended to civil war, anarchy, and brutal and horrible dictatorship, right? So other colonies said, we're doing great now. We're making money. The British aren't really too strict. They're not like some overlord. They're just pretty cool. So we'll just stay colonies. Overseas dependencies, overseas territories, whatever they want to call it this decade. But there was this idea that they didn't want to be dominions anymore, because dominion was understood as a self-governing colony, but not a true independent country. And so in 1950, they dropped the word dominion, really, and they started to use this term Commonwealth Realm. A realm, because you see, you had to, because you had the Commonwealth republics. So they had to come up with a term that would differentiate between a republic and the ones that would still retain the Queen as their head of state, or the King until 1952 as their head of state. So they came up with the term Commonwealth Realm. And Canada no longer called itself the Dominion of Canada. If you look at any Canadian money until 1950, it always says Dominion of Canada. And then after that, it just says Canada. All right. So we have Commonwealth Realms. And they stopped using the term the Queen in Canada, or the King in Canada. And since the time of Queen Elizabeth, 1952, 63 years now, they have used the term the Queen of Canada. And this is very important because, or the Queen of Australia, or the Queen of Jamaica, or the Queen of St. Lucia, or the Queen of Grenada. There are 16 Commonwealth realms. Great Britain, the original realm, and the Commonwealth realms. The Queen of Tuvalu, the Queen of Papua New Guinea, the Queen of Belize, formerly British Honduras. So you have, going back to like Scotland and England in 1603, you have different countries, but they share the same monarch. So the Queen of Great Britain over there is also the Queen of Belize over there, next to Mexico. The Queen of Canada is the same person who's the Queen of the Solomon Islands in the Pacific Ocean, all right? Each of these countries has a governor general modeled on the Canadian model. If you go to the Papua New Guinea website, the Commonwealth Realm of Papua New Guinea, they have a section about the Governor General of Papua New Guinea. Now, some countries like Australia use a hyphen, Governor hyphen General. Canada just uses Governor General without a hyphen. Same idea though. And so they follow the British Convention, meaning that the Governor General, who was there in place of the Queen, and now when the Queen visits, she's in place of herself. Okay, so she's there on her own. But the Governor General will follow convention, advise, warn, question in private bills, but not explicitly take sides with parties or try to run the day-to-day operations of the government. So it's very important. But don't think that like say, the Governor General of the Bahamas has no power. You'll notice that oftentimes big businesses, corporations, world leaders, President of the United States, they'll go to the Bahamas and they'll meet with the Governor General. The Governor General lives in a big palace called Government House, huge place up on top of a hill. They wouldn't let me go in. The Governor General of all these countries has, or most of these countries, has their own flag. Well, all of them, they all have their own flag. And the Queen has her own flag in many of the countries. The Queen has her own flag of Jamaica. The Queen of Jamaica, Elizabeth II, has her own flag. And that flag flies higher than any flag in Jamaica. No flag in Jamaica, including the national flag, is allowed to fly over the Queen's flag when she's in country. Or in Canada, the Queen's flag in Canada takes precedence over even the Canadian national flag. And there's a royal anthem of Canada, God Save the Queen, and there's a national anthem, O Canada. But so these people are important, and like I say, they're involved. The Governor General of the Bahamas is involved in not the day-to-day operations, but the overall direction of the country. That would be a good word to use. They're not out of the loop. They're not just sitting up there flipping through photo albums. Okay, they're involved, very deeply involved. The Queen herself is very deeply involved in these countries. If you get on their website, Tuesday is her Commonwealth Realm Day. Commonwealth Realm Day, the Queen is up there in the palace going through each of the 16 countries, contacting Governor General of Canada, Governor General of Tuvalu, of Antigua and Barbuda, the Governor General of Barbados, and she's either talking to them on the phone or corresponding by email. And not, email, obviously one of her secretaries is going to write the email, but they are definitely saying, well, do you think this is a good idea to have that law passed? You might want to talk to the Prime Minister about that. So they are definitely involved, and they're not detached. So her interest in the Commonwealth countries is very serious. It is not only symbolic. It's largely symbolic. It's certainly not only symbolic. The Queen does not rule Australia. She's the ruler of Australia, but she does not directly rule Australia. But the Governor General of Australia is involved. In fact, even uses his reserve powers from time to time. In 1975, the Governor General used his reserve or his royal prerogative to fire the Prime Minister. So, which was very controversial, especially with the party that got sacked. Now, the party that won said, "Yay, well, that's good. He should have used his powers." So it's so different than what we have in the United States. We just don't have any conception of these types of systems. See, most Americans don't. They just don't know. Here's a dollar bill from the Bahamas, and you can see there's Queen Elizabeth on the dollar. And here's a Canadian quarter, and there's the Queen. Of course, there's something to do with Canada on the back. Some picture of, looks like a guy with a horse in a wheat field. And then there's the Canadian $2, the toonie. DG Regina. DG Deo Gracia Regina in German, by the grace of God, Queen. So I was talking to, when I went to the Bahamas, and I went on a tour of Parliament. I went to their Supreme Court, which was actually not the Supreme Court. It's really just a circuit court, we would call it. And I went to a parliamentarian debate, went to the police department. They took me on a tour of the Bahamian police, and they gave me a book. But I was talking to one of the police chiefs, and I said, I see you have a crown on your cap. He said, yes, we have to take an oath of allegiance to the Queen every 5 years. They have to renew their oath to the Queen. Now, one more thing before I get off. I gotta go see who's calling, and plus I want to listen to a radio show. I listen to a political radio show, but In 1982, the British did something called patriating the British North America Act. They took the British North America Act, which was a British law. This was basically the Constitution of Canada. Canada's Constitution was a British law, and it could not be changed without the permission of the British Parliament. So you could say technically Canada was a colony even until 1982. And there was a bunch of consternation about it. And finally they got this passed. The British Parliament passed a law saying that now they're going to have the Canadian Constitution Act, which said now this British law is going to be controlled by Canada. And now Canada could change the British North America Act without the British Parliament approving a change. Okay, so they did the same thing for Australia and New Zealand in 1986. So Australia can now today change her constitution without the British Parliament's permission. Of course, the British Parliament, even before 86, would always, go along with it unless they were going to make some, insane change, which they wouldn't do. So since 1982, Canada has really truly been independent in every way, except that they share a monarch. And then, by the way, the Canadians are not allowed to get rid of the monarchy or change anything about the monarchy unless all the 10 provinces agree. Unanimous agreement. So they couldn't just say, well, we're going to vote, and if 51% of the Canadians vote to get rid of the monarchy, we'll just have that. It could not work that way. It would have to be every province agreeing to do it. That would be very hard to do. Also, if you look at countries like Belize and Jamaica and the Bahamas and those the formerly British colonies down at the Commonwealth Realms down in the Caribbean, like I said, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Grenada, they tried to create a super colony there called the Federation of the West Indies, but that only lasted 4 years and it collapsed because those little future countries couldn't get along, so the British just said, forget it. And some of their other federations failed too, like the Federation of Central Africa. But the thing about Jamaica is they don't really have a Supreme Court. They're not quite independent because you can appeal. At times they can appeal. People can appeal a court decision to the British Privy Council in Great Britain. So what we would call in the United States, what we would call the Supreme Court for Jamaica is actually in London. So, and this is the truth. So the Supreme Court of the Bahamas is not in Nassau, the capital of the Bahamas. It's in London. So that's sort of an oddity in a way. It's sort of a strange thing. So that's the British. That's a very quick and not very good explanation of the family of nations, the nation of nations, the Commonwealth of Nations, and Commonwealth Realms. It's a pretty elementary explanation, but considering most people don't know anything about it, I guess it couldn't hurt. Be interested in what people say about it, comments and whatever. So there's so much more to be said, but who would want to hear it? I would, but that doesn't mean anybody else would. So thank you for watching this video production.